And why are you outraged at the fact that we're dropping bombs every 12 minutes that permanently separates families? Not only families, but communities. They're literally carpet bombing neighborhoods. And that's under the Trump administration. So it's just completely selective outrage. And you have to question when you see the media 24/7, wall-to-wall coverage trying to foment something. You have to wonder what is behind it, what billion-dollar apparatus is behind this, and why. But yeah, I mean, the corporate media, it's bare bones like what they are. I mean, they literally exist to try to sell imperialism.
Hello everyone and welcome to Primo Nutmeg, media for free minds. I am your host, Steve, and on today's show, my guest is the one and only Abby Martin. As you of course know, Abby is the host of the Empire Files on Telesur. Folks, we have a great discussion today. We cover everything from the corporate media's coverage of Donald Trump and Russiagate, to US foreign policy, to what's happening in the Middle East. And at the end of today's show, we also discuss Abby's recent Twitter feud with John Stossel. Abby Martin, welcome to Primo Nutmeg.
Thank you so much, Steve. I love the name of your podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, I've actually been torn at times to change it because it's a little weird, but as I was telling you before we started recording, it's based on the fact that Connecticut is the nutmeg state, and I think it's unique, so I think we'll stick with it.
It's memorable. It reminds me that I need some premium grade nutmeg myself.
Well, you of course are a famous journalist, and some of the breaking political news this week was the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York. So I know that you covered Bernie Sanders a little bit and just that progressive movement that's been kind of building in the U.S. over recent years. What do you think that this primary victory says for that movement?
So it's, I'm such a cynic, but I'm also trying as hard as I can to be optimistic about this because it is a huge thing. I mean, especially given the last 100+ years of just vehement anti-communist rhetoric and policy. I mean, we're talking about how people have actually died and, countries overthrown, obviously, because of this ideology. So it is amazing. I mean, in name recognition alone, the fact that Bernie Sanders was able to kind of rebrand socialism and make it palatable for the first time in so long to younger generations where they actually think of it more favorably than capitalism. So I think in the name alone, the fact that a democratic socialist won and unseat this really long-term democratic operative who was basically a shoo-in to replace Nancy Pelosi is a huge thing, right? And we can't really downplay just how monumental that victory is alone. However, I think there were a lot of circumstances, like the fact that the voter turnout was so low, and we know that the Democrats really do have a machine behind them, a very well-oiled machine where they can get out tens of thousands of votes. And I think that if they underestimated her, just like they underestimated Trump. And it's just the arrogance and ego of the Democratic Party that doesn't understand that they could actually be unseated because they just expect people to show up for them. So there's a couple things. I mean, it's amazing that we have one other person inside the system to really fight from within, and that is a really great thing. However, we have to really look at the bigger picture, and I don't know if we can really replicate that victory across the country because of how systematic the destruction of really democracy has been, whether it be the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, just the existence of the Electoral College, the fact that you actually have to work within a centrist right-wing party, essentially, to even try to make a change from within. I mean, that's why I always advocate we need to crush this two-party dictatorship, because it's really hard to really invigorate leftists and progressives to want to jump in the Democratic Party and go gung-ho. So it's amazing. It's great. Of course, you're seeing the neoliberal corporate media immediately try to hijack this momentum and say, hey, wow, look at the star. And it's like, where the hell have you guys been? All you do is demonize Bernie Sanders. All you do is root for radical centrism. So please don't pretend like this is amazing for you. It's obviously just about how can they co-opt this energy and fold it into their base. So we just have to be astute and aware and continue to be critical and plug along, but also kind of, we can be optimistic and really excited about this, but we also have to be realistic about the long-term goals here.
So I did just want to mention a tweet that you put out as well, because another breaking news story of this week was the fact that Justice Anthony Kennedy announced that he's resigning at the end of July. And this puts Democrats in a little bit of a tough situation, because they essentially have no way to override a nomination. But you had tweeted, "Can't wait for the Democrats to happily vote in Trump's Supreme Court nominee, then turn around and blame Susan Sarandon, Jill Stein, and leftists for appointing him," which I thought was a pretty good tweet. So could you maybe just speak to that, like the battle that's going on within the Democratic Party, where they are trying to push out any sort of outside voices, and again, they are blaming people like Jill Stein and Susan Sarandon and anybody who doesn't sort of follow the party line, and kind of accuse them, even though they're to the left of the Democratic Party, of essentially being Trump supporters?
First, let's start with the Supreme Court. The fact that during the Obama administration, we know exactly what happened. We had Mitch McConnell, this archaic tortoise-shelled monster, who basically just promised. I mean, he said that his biggest feat was looking Obama in the face and saying, "We are not going to nominate your Supreme Court justice." And we know that Obama ended up putting through one of the most generic, semi-conservative justices, I mean, comparatively. And also, he didn't want to push through another one, even though there was an opportunity, because he knew what he was up against. And I absolutely blame him. He could have done monumental things when he had control of both the House and the Senate during the first 2 years. But even so, I mean, he really took a back seat and really didn't want to make waves and fight the Republicans that had already made it clear, fueled by, I think, a lot of racism and bigotry, that they were not going to comply with anything he did. And he just kind of acquiesced to that. So, keeping that in mind, it's amazing that Trump is already, could have two positions under his term, that he's just going to steamroll through these radical right judges. He's already done it with the Fifth Circuit court judges all across the country that no one's talking about. I mean, these are lifetime appointments. These are going to be in for generations. I'm just confused. I'm confused why we've allowed it to get to this point. Finally, here we are. This is what the Democrats have been holding at the barrel of a gun to manipulate and emotionally bribe us through every election. Well, it all comes down to the Supreme Court. Do you want abortion or do you not? And so, of course, they're going to just look and sneer and jest at the Bernie Sanders supporters and Susan Sarandon, like they like to blame every time Trump does something maniacal that Hillary Clinton actually would have done. And not the Supreme Court justice, but I'm just thinking of these Hillary Clinton operatives that like to mock Susan Sarandon and Bernie Sanders voters and leftists every time Trump does something that literally Hillary would have done. And Hillary could have even done more. Like, for example, when the Syria bombing happened, when Trump bombed Syria, Neera Tanden actually had the audacity to say, "Thanks, Susan Sarandon," as if Hillary wasn't calling for a no-fly zone right. within like the first months of getting in there. So it's just the arrogance, like this elite arrogance and out-of-touch attitude with just demonizing constantly and punching left without taking responsibility and accountability for their own faults and really understanding, how did we get Trump? He didn't just fall out of the goddamn sky, and no, Putin didn't appoint him. He got there because of the generations and decades of neoliberal economic destruction and corporate takeover that the Democrats have been part and parcel for. So the Supreme Court, it's going to be really, really, I was shocked when I found out that Kennedy was leaving, because I knew exactly what was going to happen. It's just another thing to hold over all the heads of the non-Hillary Clinton supporters. Look at what happened, and just more ammo and fodder for these people to just use in the next election cycle, which we know ultimately is what they care about. Again, the Democrats have folded down like a carpet for all of the nominees that Trump has put forward, including Gina Haspel. This is a woman who's the torturer in chief. She sadistically loves to torture, according to her colleague, John Kiriakou. And they freaking greenlighted this woman, and on top of all these other horrible evangelical crazy people. I mean, Blackwater-esque maniacs who are just in the administration, these science believing, I mean, the list goes on and on and on of these criminals who are now overseeing the entire government because the Democrats have not fought. There's just minute differences between these parties. It really is. And this immigration debacle really kind of elucidates how, okay, well, as long as we go back to the Democratic policy of mass humane deportation, I guess it's all good. So when Trump crosses a certain line, whether it be the Muslim ban or this, the Democrats really love to use this fuel to rally everyone up. But when you look at their actually policies, there's very, very little differences. So you just saw them blanketly voting for the NSA spying. You know, they want to paint Trump as this authoritarian Nazi-esque Hitler, the next Hitler, yet they for some reason feel comfortable enough giving him endless war powers and spying powers, which is what we just saw, a near $1 trillion defense bill in Trump's hands. Great job, Dems.
Well, you did, of course, bring up the accusation that Putin played some role in Trump's election. And, on this show, I've had Ralph Nader on, I've had Noam Chomsky on, and they've, criticized this. They said, the real reason is because the Democrats didn't have a worthwhile candidate or a worthwhile platform.
Doesn't seem to be a significant issue. I think it's picked up by the Democrats and by the liberal press because they hate Trump, of course, and are trying to find some way to undermine him. Democrats are seeking an excuse for why they lost an election, which should have been an open shut affair if they'd ran a decent campaign and had decent programs.
Jill Stein also has said that, of course, she has been the victim of some of these Russiagate allegations because she attended an RT dinner back in 2015. I know you, of course, worked for RT at one point in time. And actually, Abby, the first time that I had ever heard about you was when you had spoke out against Russia's military intervention in Ukraine. And this was kind of spun by the U.S. media as, I believe they even said that you had quit your job over that, right?
Yeah, correct. A lot of people got it wrong to try to fuel the anti-Russia hysteria, paint me as like a useful idiot.
So when I had Noam Chomsky on last week, I put a clip in the show of the 2012 election because it's very curious when you see the difference in the Democratic Party from 2012 to 2016. Because in 2012, one of Barack Obama's main lines against Mitt Romney was that Mitt Romney had a Cold War mentality because he said that Russia was our number one geopolitical foe.
Because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But, Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s. You indicated that we shouldn't be passing nuclear treaties with Russia, despite the fact that 71 senators, Democrats and Republicans, voted for it.
And John Kerry even joked about that at the DNC convention. He was saying Mitt Romney has only seen Russia in Rocky IV.
He's even blurted out the preposterous notion that Russia is our number one geopolitical foe. Folks, Sarah Palin said she could see Russia from Alaska. Mitt Romney talks like he's only seen Russia by watching Rocky IV. I tell you.
And then from 2012 until 2016, you see this massive change where Democrats just became such hawks against Russia. But what do you think it was that caused the Democrats to become such hawks? Do you think it was specifically Ukraine, or do you think maybe it had something to do with Edward Snowden as well? Just overall, what's your take?
As you know, probably we were instrumental in getting Yeltsin in this kind of neoliberal fire sale after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the U.S. definitely did meddle significantly in Russian politics. And we were actually boys with Putin until he basically opposed the Iraq War. So that's when the relationship kind of changed. But in terms of, this really hostile, kind of hawkish rhetoric in foreign policy, I think you just see a lot of factional splits within the establishment. Like right now, you have the Boltonites who are more like America Firsters, who are more focused on different countries other than Russia. The Bannonites were more focused on the Middle East, a marching war with China eventually. But then the Democrats seem to be more hyper-focused on Russia. And like you said, this is a laughable talking point back during the 2012 election. So yeah, I think different things presented themselves, opportunities to demonize Russia. RT was already a significant threat, poking a thorn, basically a thorn in the side of the establishment. We know from the DNI report. One has to just look at this DNI report that was allegedly the smoking gun for Russian quote-unquote meddling. And what is the report? The report basically is just a crude analysis of RT programming, saying that the RT programming of talking about inequality, and specifically my show, mind you. So I'm actually one of the reasons why Russia meddled, even though I've never had a meeting with Putin. And he's never told me what to do. But yeah, the actual analysis of the show is just inequality, talking about realities in this country. That is the threat. That is the threat to the media system, the fact that, the media is basically an arm of the empire, and it's weaponized to basically just propagandize Americans and to sell our policies. So when you have an apparatus like RT or Telesur in a minor sense, that really starts to undermine this conventional wisdom and these myths that generate all of this complacency and complicity from the American populace. So I think that RT, coupled with the Ukraine incursion, gave the U.S. establishment kind of a reason to blame Russia, to deflect, again, they just love to deflect all of their problems on who's the next enemy. And we know with the neoconservative agenda, with the Robert Kagans and all of these thought leaders and ideologues that have been drafting foreign policy prescriptions for the last 15 years, I mean, we know that Russia was ultimately what they wanted. Russia is the next prize and China is the ultimate prize, right? And we're talking about capitalism and how it's expansionist, and that's why empire has expanded to every corner of the earth. And so naturally, the inevitability of this system is to try to war with those next two superpowers. So it's all just fomenting the ground and sowing the seeds for what the ultimate battle will be. And the neocons are very smart, and they knew how to harness the energy, and they knew that basically the liberal establishment, and look at the liberal establishment now. I mean, they have no idea what the hell is going on, and all they can do is deflect everything on Russia. I mean, it's almost embarrassing. It's very childish and mortifying for them that a year and a half into this administration, all they can really do is blame Russia for the egregious, horrible problems in this country. Russia is not why half of Americans are living in poverty or why black people are getting killed with impunity in the streets. That's a very, very specific thing to this country, a country that was built on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans. There's a reason why we're the richest country in the world. There's a reason why we have all these disturbing, unique phenomenons going in here, whether it be the mass shooting phenomenon, the fact that suicides are going up here where they're going down in every other country. There's some very, very disturbing things that we need to reckon with as a society before we start deflecting all of our problems on imaginary foes. And in fact, all of this has just emboldened and actually made Putin stronger than he ever has been. He just won with nearly 80% of the vote in the last presidential election.
I guess from my perspective, I just think it's specifically very sad about the Democratic Party because, I was out there marching against the Iraq War, 13 years ago. And, I voted for Barack Obama 10 years ago because it seemed like at the time the Democratic Party got it more. They understood what Bush had done to kind of, lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but also capitalize off of 9/11 and that kind of hysteria to silence dissent and, create these domestic spying tools and whatnot. And it seems like the Democratic Party has just become a complete inversion of itself at this point where Russiagate is essentially this decade's Iraqi WMD.
Really good point. And I'm thinking of that article that I just read about how all the Democrats are basically running the most amount of intelligence officials, former defense contractors, basically military personnel in the next election. I mean, that's their answer to when they see something like Trump. Their answer is to actually go right, go further within the trenches of whatever the deep state is, the military-industrial complex, and that's how out of touch they are. They just keep folding into the most bizarre, radical centrism. And, I think that you look at both parties and how they've careened over the past decade. It's very fascinating because during the 2016 election, I mean, we all thought that both parties were just imploding. I mean, I thought, how are the Republicans going to recover from this, knowing that Donald Trump is really the only person who's galvanizing any sort of support? And I knew how awful Hillary Clinton was, obviously, and what they were doing to Bernie Sanders. Looking back on it, it's extremely interesting how the Republicans opened their tent to everyone. Rapists, Nazis, bigots. The Democrats did the opposite, where they closed off everything to the left of the center and actually, just blaming and marginalizing anyone to the left of that kind of corporate centrism. And that's a really interesting strategy because it's a losing one. And they know that it's a losing one because they've seen it over and over and over again. I mean, obviously the Trump victory was the most telling culmination of this strategy. So the question is, why do they keep doing it? Well, because they'd rather actually have fascism than actually try to overthrow the system that protects their privilege. They are so short-sighted, and they are so just concerned about their positions and their power that they're willing to actually tank the entire country. And they'll just use Trump and whatever happens with this administration to just say, see, told you so, told you what happens when you don't vote for us. It's very, very interesting. But again, I mean, what can we really expect from a party who has shown themselves very clearly to represent the exact same entrenched corporate power that the Republicans do? They've just chosen to mask it in this identity politics, to hijack the revolutionary language, whether it be the immigrant rights movement, Black Lives Matter, the fight for 15, they know how to couch themselves in this rhetoric. And that's why voters, look, they've emotionally blackmailed us and made us feel so goddamn guilty that, of course, people are just going to be trapped into this endless cycle thinking that the Democrats, even if they're just an eke better than the Republicans, of course, they're going to still generate that voting base. And so I think it has to get to a point where people realize that the Democratic Party is not the answer. There's no other developed country in the world that forces a two-party dictatorship, one a proto-fascist party and another a center-right party, and actually expects the citizenry to be okay with that and to accept that. That's insane. So yeah, of course we need to overhaul this two-party dictatorship, and we need to call out the Democrats as being just part and parcel with the corporate tyranny. Because if we don't do that, and if we don't try to work outside of the system, put massive amount of pressure on the Democrats, that's how any policy gets passed, whether it be DACA or during the Bush administration to try to prevent the felony at the border that he was trying to do when the immigrants' rights movement came out. It's a massive amount of people in the street that's the only thing that's going to force the policy, whether it be a Democrat or Republican in office. But we also need to fight for third party. We need to fight for third-party representation and new parties. We cannot keep folding ourselves into the Democrats because where is it going to get us? Again, it's just insane to keep doing this over and over again and expecting something different. We don't have time to lose. That's the difference of this time and before. I heard someone say that history repeats itself, but every time the stakes get higher. And right now the stakes are pretty goddamn high.
You know what's funny, too, is if you look at the corporate media and their coverage of Donald Trump, I think that kind of gives you a lot of clues on where the neoliberal agenda really is, because the main point of criticism is Russiagate and trying to suggest some kind of Russian collusion and the end game there being starting a new Cold War. But then you see the corporate media celebrate Donald Trump whenever he does anything that's offensive in terms of foreign policy. So, you know, when the U.S. gets involved in Yemen, they either don't talk about it or celebrate it. And especially I'm thinking of the two nights for the past 2 years when Donald Trump bombed Syria. That's when the MSNBC really became Donald Trump fans. And you had Brian Williams talking about the beauty. He was guided by the beauty of our weapons or some kind of nonsense. So I think it's really funny how the corporate media celebrates Trump when he starts bombing other countries. And shouldn't that show how fake the news really is when they pretend to be opponents to Trump, but then start supporting him as soon as he does something military offensive?
Thank you for saying that, because that is the most bizarre thing to me, and that should really pique people's curiosity more than anything else. And what message is that sending to Trump? All Trump really wants, and this is why he's doing all these dumbass campaign rallies all across the country, because he just wants to be adullated and told that he's great. And what message is that sending when the corporate media, you know, how he hates the liberal media, he calls it all fake news, and he just can't stop whining about it on Twitter all day? Well, guess what? There's a bipartisan support for bombing, baby. So what is the president going to do, you know, in the future when he knows, hey, you know what I can do to actually make everyone love me? Kill people, ramp up military escalations. That's highly disturbing. Good point. You know, let's look at what the corporate media is. The corporate media it's an arm of the empire. It's weaponized to sell policies, and it's subsidized by banks, oil companies, and defense contractors. That's why you see ads for tanks. I mean, we're not buying that shit. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I mean, they really, really reveal their hand a lot, and they reveal it time and again when they manufacture these outrages, these crises, and the cognitive dissonance that I find absolutely stunning is this immigration hysteria. And on one hand, it is horrible. It's a Nazi-esque policy and that we should all be outraged about. On the other hand, why weren't you outraged during Obama? Right. And why are you outraged at the fact that we're dropping bombs every 12 minutes that permanently separates families? Not only families, but communities. They're literally carpet bombing neighborhoods. And that's under the Trump administration. So it's just completely selective outrage. And you have to question when you see the media 24/7, wall-to-wall coverage trying to foment something. You have to wonder what is behind it. What billion-dollar apparatus is behind this and why? But yeah, I mean, the corporate media, it's bare bones like what they are. I mean, they literally exist to try to sell imperialism and U.S. hegemony. And that's why you see every time we talk about whether it be North Korea, Venezuela, or Syria, who are the guests on all these roundtable discussions? Pentagon, like defense contractors and Pentagon officials and generals who are parading around just hour after hour talking about, limiting the parameters of debate. Well, we have to do something, right? So what are we going to do? So it's very, very insidious because a lot of people don't really realize who these guests are on the rotation. And, if you're not a media analyst, you can get tricked and swindled. And that's actually the exact point. They want to pretend like they're part of the resistance, but really they are pushing Trump hilariously from the quote-unquote left to actually ramp up the military. And that's just stunning.
Well, what I wonder, too, is it was just announced that Trump is going to meet with Putin in a few weeks in Helsinki. And we know what happened when Trump recently met to kind of stop the hostilities with North Korea, how that was covered by the corporate media. And, you had Rachel Maddow out there essentially saying that we need to not do that and we need to have a military sort of stance towards North Korea. And I think, when Trump meets with Putin, we're going to see a similar type thing where you're going to have all the Russiagate stuff get propped up again. And then you're going to also have Cold War rhetoric being pushed out there and trying to get people to not support a peace deal or reduction of tensions. And you're kind of seeing that already in just the announcement that there's going to be a meeting. You're seeing that again, Trump's betraying NATO and our allies and working against them. Again, I just think people are going to have a hard time kind of deciphering truth and fiction.
No, I think that this is one instance where the majority of people want peace. And I think that the corporate media, again, revealing their hand, like selling war with North Korea, mocking Trump, and actually having the audacity, not only Rachel Maddow, you have everyone from Ronan Farrow to all over these quote-unquote liberal corporate media stations that are just demonizing Trump for meeting with Kim Jong-un. And you know what? Props to him. I'm glad that my reptile brain hasn't taken over my goddamn sense of logic. I'm glad that I'm not so in the trenches of being such a partisan hack that I'm able to see the good in what's going on. And actually, this is very good. It's very good that finally a U.S. leader meets with another leader of a country that we've been declared an enemy with for the last 60 years. I mean, and what really pisses me off about every single point and story that I see about North Korea is just the complete omission in the context about the history. And they always just flip the narrative. They don't ever talk about the Korean War, this forgotten war that decimated Korea, killed 25% of the population, leveled all of the infrastructure. And they just act like North Korea is this crazy genocidal, monstrous country that's a military fortress for no reason. There's no, how did we get here and why? Why is North Korea like that? Would they have been like that if they weren't constantly being threatened by the most powerful empire in the world to be obliterated? So that really pisses me off. And of course, even how the country split because some State Department guy just drew a line through a National Geographic map. And this is why there's this devastating partition of the same people for so long. The overwhelming majority of Koreans want this. And that's another thing that pisses me off, the ethnocentrism of Americans, the audacity for Americans to even think it's their place to have a say in what the hell happens to Korea. How dare you? How dare us even think that we can decide this? You know what I mean? So Koreans want this. Everyone wants this. The world wants this. And when you have the corporate media trying as hard as they can to actually not make peace happen, you have to ask what's really going on. And it kind of makes a little more sense when you realize, again, the defense contractors who subsidize these stations and their stocks plummeted after that peace announcement was made.
Right.
They don't want that at all. They want that China pivot. They want the Asia pivot, and they don't want to withdraw those troops from Korea, Japan, or Guam. And we even saw Democrats, again, going back to these hawkish Dems who are trying to, they expose themselves as basically being lackeys of the Pentagon. They're going forward and trying to push measures to preemptively block Trump from removing any troops from South Korea. This is what happened when Jimmy Carter got into office, too. He campaigned on the promise to remove troops from Korea, and he was blocked immediately by the Pentagon stooges who pretend like they're actual public officials running the government. So that's the truth. And, again, Trump, love him or hate him, but this is an amazing thing that he did, and he will go down in history books if he really does make this happen. And it will be determined whether his ego can kind of rise above the media trying to prevent this from happening. It's going to be up to him to try to push this through, and we'll see. But again, the question remains that will the empire really allow Korea to have normalized relations south and north, and will capitalism really allow a communist state to exist without under severe stifling sanctions that are starving its people and causing a horrible economic devastation? I mean, it's hard to imagine.
Well, the way that you're describing North Korea, it actually reminds me of another subject. I know that you've gone to Israel and Palestine and covered the conflict there. And it seems like the U.S. is in a very kind of similar situation where they're propping up the Israeli regime. They're providing them with weapons and nuclear weapons as well. And I just maybe wanted you to speak a little bit on that. I know that you went there and covered that on the ground. What do you think it is that most Americans don't know or don't understand about what's happening in Palestine?
So I didn't know even what Palestine was until I was in college. So I think that really tells you all you need to know about what Americans do and do not know. We literally hear one side of the story. We hear that Israel has a right to exist and that Palestinians are terrorists. That's why after 9/11, you saw wall-to-wall coverage of Palestinians dancing in the street. That's why you continue to hear Palestinians be lumped in with rhetoric demonizing Muslims and even on par with ISIS. So I think that Americans have no clue. And we're subsidizing this apartheid criminal colonial occupation with $10 million a day. $10 million a day. So what is that money going to? Well, going back to your point about what do Americans think, they think that probably a lot of them think that Palestine and Israel exist next to each other and that they just have problems, right? And it's just a conflict that's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's the most complicated conflict in the world. What the reality is that Palestine, full of millions of indigenous Arabs, was overtaken by a colonial occupation that has constantly been growing via ethnic cleansing violently since its inception. It was built on top of another country. And what happened with that indigenous population? Well, the same with any colonial occupation. They're killed or removed forcibly from their land. And we're seeing that going on and on and on. So people have no idea that there's a brutal occupation going on in the West Bank, and they have no idea that Gaza is under complete siege. And I'll just briefly explain both instances, because once people hear about it, I mean, once you see, you can't unsee. And so it's just a matter of letting people know, hey, here's what's actually going on. And I think that people have enough decent basic humanity and empathy that they can say, hey, I actually do not agree with this at all. I mean, the West Bank is under Israeli military law, brutal, like martial law. You can't, not only can you not have weapons at all, even though colonial settlers can move on top of your village and firebomb you and assault you on a daily basis, you have no recourse to protect yourself. On top of that, you can't organize. There's no political parties. You can't hold a flag. That's illegal. You can't be in groups of 5 or more people. The constant harassment and dehumanization of things going on in the West Bank, the flying checkpoints, the fact that soldiers are going on invading villages on a daily basis. Ahed Tamimi slapped a soldier. Well, is it any goddamn wonder why she slapped a soldier when you realize how many family members have been massacred? Her cousin was just killed a couple days ago. This is happening on a daily basis. They just welded a Palestinian family's house. They're using attack dogs. They go into these refugee camps where tens of thousands of Palestinians are still there because, according to the UN, they have the right to return to their homes they were ethnically cleansed from during the Nakba. the Israeli soldiers go in, tear gas these refugee camps, and spray skunk spray in their water tanks that they only get once a month, and they have to actually administer them to the entire household. The skunk spray is a manufactured spray by the IDF that mimics actual raw sewage. And that's just to spoil every single thing, every basic humanity that Palestinians have. They want to make life uninhabitable for them, and that's just in the West Bank. There's an apartheid system going on in Israel proper within the 48 borders, and then you look at Gaza. I mean, come on, it's 2 million people trapped in a prison. This whole mantra about the border fence is a fallacious misnomer. It's a fencing in 2 million people from their own homes, from their own land. 97% of the water's laden with sewage. They can't even flee on a boat. I can't even think of another area in the world where refugees can't even flee via the ocean, or they'll get killed by Israeli soldiers. They want to make life pounded back to the Stone Age so that Gazans living in Gaza will absolutely have no ability to even fight what's going on. I mean, Israel controls their land. It's completely under siege. All of these people who, so that's the premise of why they were protesting with the Great March of Return, which we saw one of the most egregious massacres in human history,
right,
being covered up by the mass media, where you had over 1,000 Palestinians shot in the head, neck, and torso. That's how many people they wanted to kill. That's how many people they wanted to kill deliberately. Every shot was deliberate. They knew in the crosshairs that they were killing medics, journalists, amputees, children. And the fact that the world turns a blind eye. I understand that there's a sea change going on because of this massacre, but the fact that the U.S. and Nikki Haley's out there, what a mortifying scene for her to be running around pleading people to actually blame the massacre on Hamas. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I can't think of any other people who are literally blamed for their own death, destruction, and misery and massacres than these poor Palestinians who are living under complete occupation and siege, and the U.S. media has the audacity to paint it as their goddamn fault. I mean, I've never seen anything more revolting than the New York Times, the day after 62 people were gunned down in cold blood by snipers perched 100 yards away. The front page of the New York Times said, "Israelis reflect. I hope every bullet was justified."
You'd think, too, at the point where they're actually shooting journalists, that, even when you're in the corporate media and you're getting your paycheck to, just read headlines and recite these bromides, that eventually you would stop and think, there really is something wrong happening here.
You would think. You would think. I mean, I think the sea change, again, people are waking up, and but again, that's why I focus on the U.S. empire and really try to urge everyone to look at the world through the lens of the U.S. empire in terms of how did we get here. It doesn't even matter if the rest of the world boycotts Israel. It absolutely will. Let me correct that. It absolutely is devastating for the Israeli government and society to have these cultural boycotts happening. But it will not, the apartheid state will not fall as long as the U.S. is propping it up and subsidizing it every day with tens of millions of dollars. So that's why I focus on ending, this criminal machinery going on from the U.S., because it's propping up the Wahhabist theocratic dictatorship of Saudi Arabia that actually carried out 9/11, helped carry out 9/11, and the apartheid state of Israel. So, it's a trifecta of horrible criminality, and it all stems from this country, which is why I urge Americans, it's your duty to fight this government and to understand, like Chomsky so eloquently stated, if you want to stop terrorism, you have to stop participating in it. Stop committing terrorism.
Abby, you, of course, you cover these subjects on the Empire Files. I know that we're almost out of time. I did just want to ask you briefly, or give you the opportunity to speak on the fact that John Stossel recently kind of was criticizing you on Twitter. I guess because you work for Telesur, or you sell your show to Telesur, which is, I guess, a conglomerate of different state medias or something along those lines, and he was criticizing them because some of those countries are socialist. Were you anticipating getting attacked, or were you? I found it very surprising. Did you?
Yeah, I did like his drug war stuff. He's done really good work in the past. That's why I was surprised to see he's become kind of like a reasoned stooge. I mean, basically funded by the Koch brother billionaires. So it was really sad, but I guess not too shocking because I know exactly what Reason TV is, and I heard that John Stossel had recently done a report where he went out and posed as a homeless person to try to prove how capitalism can even make homeless people rich.
Okay.
He did one of those, the Geraldo Rivera's let's pose as homeless people to show how great capitalism is. So
I didn't know about that.
you know, you have to take his criticism with a grain of salt. But what was astounding about the John Stossel thing is he literally didn't even watch my reports. He just went out of the gates and said, I'm a paid liar for criminal socialist dictators. Look, that's extremely offensive. Anyone who knows my body of work and what I've put my job on the line to speak from my heart and to say the truth as I see it, I would never, that's really, really insulting. It's also libelous.
Right.
And luckily he actually took down the report when I called out numerous factual inconsistencies and egregious errors. I said, look, you basically lied blatantly about my reporting on Venezuela, and I take that very seriously because, again, Telesur is a conglomerate of 6 different Latin American countries, including Venezuela. And so to actually, claim that I'm lying and paid to lie on behalf of Maduro is just completely insulting. And he was so wrong that he had to actually remove the entire report and apologize, which really, I actually gave him credit for even doing that because a lot of these operatives just, they'll lie through their teeth and then they'll just never look back because it's all about the smear. Unfortunately, a lot of people saw that and took it at face value. And another interesting thing about the John Stossel report is he interviewed this guy. I forget his name, but he worked for something called the Antigua Report. And I was looking at what the Antigua Report is and who this guy was, and I found him just casually, very friendly, interacting with blatant Nazis on Twitter, including Faith Goldie and stuff. So I was like, wow, that's really incredible that you got this guy to comment on how Telesur is like a fascist organization when you literally are like just a completely open fascist who, talks to Nazis all the time and somehow supports them. So John Stossel is a joke, and Telesur is a block that was created by Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro to counter this media hegemony, to counter this apparatus that was fomenting regime change in all of their countries. And we saw this pink tide coming with the election of Hugo Chavez that catapulted all of these victories of progressive leaders all across Latin America, and it was a beautiful thing. But that's a big threat. That's a big threat to the oligarch peer and the empire when you have a media apparatus that's telling the truth and trying to uplift those voices that were rendered invisible by the colonizers of those countries for hundreds of years. So I'm proud to sell my show to Telesur. Unfortunately, Telesur is under direct threat with the sanctions on Venezuela because a lot of the funds get transferred in and out of Caracas. And so you're seeing these sanctions have a devastating effect. They do exactly as they're intended to do. So there's all these backhanded ways to usurp and undermine both RT and Telesur because of how much of a threat they pose to this counter narrative.
Well, I think that the really tragic thing about it is, and I don't know if you're going to disagree with me here, because I know that you're very critical of capitalism, and I know that the Ron Paul, John Stossel, right-wing libertarian crowd, they embrace capitalism, they condemn socialism, so it seems apparently to be opposites. But these two groups, I think to some degree, they're both equally marginalized, and it seems like even though there's these differences between economic beliefs, that both groups are opposed to U.S. imperialism and should put aside maybe economic differences, at least insofar as working together against U.S. imperialism. Do you agree with that, or do you think that just the economic ideologies are so different that can't happen?
In theory, I agree with you. Here's the problem, though. The problem is that libertarians and a lot of people at the Ron Paul Institute and a lot of these like right-wing Trump supporters who like to call themselves anti-interventionists, even though Trump has ramped up the empire like nobody's business, they have actually shifted kind of like the enemy is no longer, and there's obviously a few like paleo-conservatives and libertarians who still have that focus, and I respect them for that. But the majority of that movement, I would say, have turned their hatred to the left, to leftists and socialists, as if we have any power, as if we've done anything to create what we're seeing today. I mean, I guess they look at like PC culture and like liberalism in terms of identity politics and think that we've somehow destroyed the country. But I see this vitriol targeted at me where I even tried to say something to like someone who was a Ron Paul supporter, basically, who called me, well, what do you know? You're a commie. I mean, it's just, the rhetoric is so toxic that this is, how could I possibly want to align with someone who basically doesn't want me to exist, who thinks that communism is like socialism is the worst thing in the world. To me, as someone who's learned a lot since 2008, I see capitalism and imperialism as the inevitability of the capitalist structure. I mean, capitalism is expansionist, and that's why we've seen this kind of eating up of every other country's resources. That's why we've seen the U.S. empire grow and put its tentacles in almost every corner of the world. That's the basis of the system, is capitalism. And the growth, the endless growth, the fact that we just need to keep increasing profits year after year. There's zero humanity in the foundation of this economic system. So it's kind of contrary to even like the big picture thing. It's like, yeah, we can have these forge alliances maybe if we agree on like ending NSA surveillance and da-da-da, but like where does it go from there? If you guys ultimately want me to not exist, and you ultimately think that, more corporate power makes sense, when to me, that's actually how we got here in the first place. So there's a lot of big differences that I feel like I can't reconcile anymore. But I'm always open to build a consensus on ending the U.S. empire. And, if people can get behind that without their reptile brain taking over, I'm all for it.
Well, I definitely agree. I think, wherever possible, where libertarians and progressives can see that the union between big business and big government is the problem and work to kind of pull them apart, maybe, that's useful. Abby, I know that we're running over. You, of course, again, are the host of the Empire Files. Do you have any big shows coming up? Do you have any other trips to other countries?
Yeah, so I definitely want to take a road trip throughout this country and just really get to talk to people, and see what stories kind of come out of that. I think that all too much, I'm trying to plan these really big picture stuff, and I think it would be really impactful and important just to go through this country and find out where people's heads are at and try to build some sort of dialogue. Because I think that when you sit down with people, a lot of people can agree on fundamental things. A lot of people don't want to be bombing innocent people around the world every 12 minutes with their tax dollars. A lot of people don't want to be supporting apartheid. They just don't know. And, this scapegoating of immigrants and the left and Muslims and minorities, again, it comes out of fear. Fear is a huge generating thing. Fear is a very, very strong thing. So if we can somehow build these bridges and make people a little bit less scared, I think that we can forge a much better path.
Well, Abby Martin, I really do appreciate you being on Primo Nutmeg today. I also appreciate you running over a little bit here. I definitely encourage folks to check out the Empire Files. And for folks who want to follow you on social media, how can they do that?
At Abby Martin, and check out my podcast with my brother called Media Roots Radio, and my art site, abbymartin.org, and the empirefiles.tv. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Abby Martin, thank you again for being on Primo Nutmeg, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.